So, hi to all. Today's presentation in the course Data Analytics and Finance and Accounting will be about Django, the Python web framework. And my name is Lucas. And this is my outline for today. First, I will talk about why to use Django, then about the installation and the setup. Third, about the structure of the Django project, and also about the administrative components, namely the manage.py and the settings.py. And lastly, I will also get more into detail about the Django apps. And in this section, we'll talk about the HTTP request and response cycle in Django, and also about the URLs.py, models.py, and views.py as one of the main building blocks in building an app and also a part of your logic. So first of all, why Django? And it, to start, makes sense to define what we talk about. What is a web framework? And it's basically a collection of modules that abstract away the repetitive tasks and the difficulties in web development. So in order to not to start at ground zero for every web application that you want to develop, and think about stuff like how to implement URL routing. This functionality is basically provided by the web framework, and you can directly start with implementing your logic or business logic. And this is really what the web framework serves for. But there are also a lot of web frameworks out there, which brings us to the next question: why to use exactly Django? And the answer is probably because it has a very wide range of out-of-the-box supports for a lot of common tasks in web development. And so to say, the most important ones, those that you probably need in every web application, are database models, URL routing, and forms, for example. So those are provided out of the box, and you will see me getting or more talking about those in the rest of the presentations. But for completion, Django offers also a wide range of user authentication, about testing, admin interface, security and performance upgrades, and also a support for multiple database backends. So this shows Django is very powerful and has a very wide range of features. And because of that, it's also used to build very large scale web applications. So the sky is basically the limit when building applications with Django. But this also means that it's getting hard to progress all this in one presentation. So we will basically focus on the database models, URL routing, and templates for the rest. So first of all, in order to start the Django development, you will have to set up an environment. In this case, I will do it with Conda. You can also do it with virtual env, and also you could install it in other ways, but I think the installation with Conda or virtual env is the most common process. So in this case, you will firstly create the environment, and in this case, we will call it Django. Then activate it and install the Django distribution. And after that, you have basically different ways to start your Django project. But the most common one, if you really want to start from ground zero, is to type the following commands in your CLI. You can call Django admin, which will be recognized if you have Django installed, and then the command start project. with the suffix of your project name. In this case, I called it a Django project. And after that, you could also use the manage.py to start an app. So these steps will lead us to the following folder structure. We see that Django has auto-created a lot of different files in which we now will implement our logic in. And at this point, it's important to say this is one way of arranging your files and having organized your files, but you can also reconfigure it, obviously. This is one of the most default ways of organizing your files. So the structure is, like I said, almost default. The only difference is basically in the middle. You could have also the apps, app 1, app 2, etc., those folders as direct subfolders of the main folder Django project. Here I kept it this way because I think it's a nicer way to look at it, to have the apps grouped under one folder. So if you look now at the left side, the files below Django project and the manage.py, you will see mostly organizational and configuration files. And in the middle, or over those configuration files, I will talk after this slide. And in the middle, you have basically the main logic building blocks and the apps. And on the right side, you see basically static files, templates, etc., which are often separated from the other folders, but this is really up to the developer himself. And at this point, I would just like to mention that I created a Django project with extremely basic functionality that you will see displayed in the screenshot, and uploaded it to GitHub. I will use this project as an example in the rest of the presentation. And if you like to see the whole code, you can get it on GitHub. I think it's also sufficient, and also you can follow the presentation without it. It's more for completion, but you can also get it. So continuing with the Django admin and the manage.py, they are both pretty similar in the usage and the functionality, which is basically performing administrative tasks, and are mostly called by the CLI and used with CLI commands. They both serve, so to say, as an interface between everything that is abstracted away by the Django framework, so to say, below the surface, and the Django Python side that you code. And there's one difference. So while Django.py is used solely for execute project-specific tasks, the Django admin is used for system-wide tasks. And the main functionalities that those two provide are the start of new apps and projects. We've already seen that a few slides previously when I created the project in the installation slide and started a new app. And also it's used to perform adjustments to the database models and to, for example, run the development server. For example, with the Python manage.py run server. So this you will use if you want to run your Django application locally and if you want to test it locally. And the next important configuration file is the settings.py. And you can basically think of it as a file which contains module level environment variables and those define how your project is running. So for example, you will have to define which apps are installed and which apps are, so to say, known to your Django project. You will define which middleware should be installed, the location of your static files and templates, and also things like, for example, a load hosts. But also with the last point, you see that this file will basically get very more important if you switch from your normal development mode to production and when you're exposing your project to the real world. But in development mode, basically you only have to know a few variables to modify in order to make your project run. And you mostly can keep the default settings that are just auto-created. And this slide shows a screenshot of a part of the settings.py. So just in order to give you some impression how such a settings.py file can look like, you have the environment variables defined, and basically that's it. And this brings us to the next section, which will be about apps. And first of all, the question arises, what is an app? And it has nothing to do with an app on, for example, your mobile phone, but an Django app is a little component of a greater Django project, and each app focuses on one separate piece of functionality. And why does Django use this concept of apps and project? And the answer is because it really enables the programmer to keep the code very organized. And I also can tell this from my own experience when working with Django. This comes especially in pretty handy if your application grows and you have to deal with a variety of data models for different applications or different views, tests, etc. It is really a nice way of organizing your code, because when you're working on a separate piece of functionality, you have no second or third app interfering with your code that you're currently working on. So it organizes the code very very kindly for the programmer. And the aim for the following slides will be how to code such an app inside Django when sticking also to its design principles. And I want to talk about the most important components inside such an app, and also exemplify this with the code that I talked about previously, the GitHub project, and as this example is basically as basic as it can get, but also useful to get a sense of how to structure your code and to get a feeling for the main moving parts inside such a Django app. So first of all, in this section, as a starting point, I would like to show what is the most, so to say, abstract functionality that a single app should provide. And as we're talking about web applications, the app always has to deal with HTTP requests sent by a client, for example, a web browser, and then execute some specific code on it and send back a response. And getting here a little bit more into detail and also Django specific, we can see on the right side that the process usually works like this. A client sends a request to the web server, which gets redirected by an URL mapping or configuration to a view. And the view part serves as the primary entry point in the backend and will perform read-write operations on the database and also source an HTML template, which will then together be returned by the view to the web server and then back to the client. And this behavior in Django is usually coded across different Python files inside a Django app. And now I will get more into detail about these files. So in order to once again see the bigger picture of one app and also how to code it, we'll look at the folder structure once again. And Django, as we recall, has already pre-generated most of the scripts, or in this case, all of the scripts that we will use to implement the functionality. And we see those inside the subfolder app1. So we look at the models.py, the views.py, and also the urls.py, which could also be in the app1, but in this case, we still have it, or we will maintain it in the folder Django project. And this is also the file that I would like to start with. So sticking to Django design principles, this file should contain a mapping of HTTP requests and specific URLs to one view function. And at the bottom, this can look like a real, or you see a real urls.py, which basically contains the definition that every time a URL with the suffix app1 will be called, the request will be redirected to the views.main page, which is basically a view function that is imported in the third row from app1 import views. And every time that the URL is called, this view function will also be called with the request that was sent as an input. And also a very important file inside an app is the models.py file, as it contains the definitions of the data model classes. And as a background, why is this important? So the querying of data in Django is done usually using Python objects, which are in this case called models. So these models define the structure of the stored data and the database, which is behind those, or which lays behind those data models, which includes also the data types, maximum size, default values, etc. And moreover, those files also provide mechanisms for reading and writing, querying the records in the database. And also note at this point that the specific type of the database is abstracted away by this additional layer of defining those data models inside Django. You can use thereof a Oracle database or some SQLite 3 database. This is really abstracted away. And what you can do then after that with those classes is to import these inside other scripts. And through its functions, you can query data, you can change data, etc. And exactly this behavior we will use in the views.py. As we've seen already in the HTTP request response cycle slide, this is basically the function that is called from the URL mapping. And it serves as a primary entry point for the Django or Python code, so to say. And The main tasks are to receive the HTTP request, and then to perform read-write operations on the data models, also source HTML files, and then bundle everything and send it back to the client. And in the example at the bottom, we can see that exactly this behavior is implemented. The function is called, if we recall for the URLs.py definition, the function is called every time the URL app1 is requested by the client. And after that, after this has been done, the main page function will be called and will perform here a read operation of the data model, and then send this instance of the data model together with the request and the HTML template back to the client. And then as a last link, in order to understand why the website behaves exactly like this, is to look at the templates and the views, which we did previously. And when we look at the HTML template at the bottom left, we see that the sentence has not been hard-coded, but the message instance of the data model has been used. And when we recall the definition of this class, of this model in the models.py, we know that each instance has the attribute text, which is a text field itself. And exactly this one is used here to print out the sentence. And so this is not shown. The first model or the first message instance was queried in the views.py, and to the first object I assigned the text attribute with the hello DAFA course. So that's why exactly this sentence is shown here. And this is also a very useful feature that Django provides, as it enables the template to be populated really dynamically with data, which enables the programmer in the end to display different sites to different users, etc., and not to serve a static, plain static HTML file to every user. So this is also a pretty nice feature of Django, and so it has been achieved also using the render function, which comes with the Django distribution. So at this point, that's it, and thank you for the attention.